Hey everybody, welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. Well, we've got a really special show here, an interview with the Reverend Otis Moss III, senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. He is a force of nature in every sense, and you'll hear all about his incredible initiatives in green building and community empowerment. But first, a little background. We were honored to have Reverend Moss as the featured speaker at our 75th anniversary gala in Phoenix recently. He was kind enough to come down to Arizona from Chicago. Now, the reason we were there is that the founder of what became the Lincoln Institute, John C. Lincoln, made his fortune as an inventor at the turn of the century in Cleveland, but then moved down to the Phoenix area in the 1930s, a pioneering move that so many would make down to the desert Southwest in the years that followed. He became a noted philanthropist and entrepreneur in Phoenix, and the Lincoln family stayed in the area from then on. His granddaughter, Katie Lincoln, is the current chair of the board of the organization. The Lincoln and Moss families had a Cleveland connection, which you'll hear about in just a bit, but part of the reason it was so fitting that Reverend Moss addressed us was, here is a faith leader who has dedicated himself to environmental progress and figured out ways to have an outsized impact, operating out of a compact organization, perhaps in some ways similar to the Lincoln Institute. He has renovated his church and a library and established affordable housing and a health center, all on the south side of Chicago. And he does this work based on three guiding principles: that the work be in line with the highest of green building practices, that the projects are built by craftspeople from the local community, and that at least some of those workers include the formerly incarcerated. So I invite you now to sit back and take in this extraordinary conversation with Reverend Otis Moss III, recorded at the Mountain Shadows Resort in Paradise Valley, Arizona. Reverend Otis Moss III, thank you for joining this conversation on Land Matters.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with Cleveland. We are here in Phoenix celebrating the Lincoln Institute's 75th anniversary because John C. Lincoln, the founder, moved from Cleveland to the Phoenix area. He was really a pioneer out here in that regard. But he made his fortune in Cleveland as an inventor and entrepreneur, and Cleveland sounds like it was quite a place back at the turn of the century. I hoped you could tell us a little bit about your own Cleveland story and Cleveland connections.
Cleveland, without a doubt, is a city that I have great love for. Grew up there. I'm Ohio born and raised, born in Cincinnati, raised in the Cleveland area. And my family moved to Cleveland during two unique moments. One was in the shadow of the deindustrialized moment of Cleveland. I believe that Dennis Kucinich was mayor at the time. But at the same time, the unique transformative movement in terms of Black political power. So we came after Carl Stokes had become mayor. There was a huge shift in terms of economic power throughout the Midwest, from Detroit to Cleveland, then down south with Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young. And so we were in the midst of that. I was a very small child in the 70s at that time, but nonetheless, that shaped the vision of what Cleveland could be, looking at all of these other cities and how they were navigating this deindustrialized moment, specifically Atlanta, and how Atlanta was making a major shift. And Cleveland was looking at Atlanta, looking at Detroit, looking at New York, looking at LA. What do we do in this post-industrial moment where we are not the steel mill city anymore? What will we be in the future? So trying to bring in BP oil was a big deal. I remember hearing that as a small kid. TRW, all of these different companies that were being courted to be a part of the Cleveland economic revival and the reimagining of what downtown Cleveland could be. So I was growing up as a child in the 80s, and there were all these visions of bringing people back to downtown, housing in downtown, changing the small airport that we had downtown into something unique where people could live and thrive. And so they were looking at Chicago as a model of how the lake becomes one of your greatest resources for a city.
And that transformation continues, and the Lincoln Institute is a part of that, looking at these so-called legacy cities. It's inspiring. It's been a bit of a long journey, though. As you look back, are you satisfied with what Cleveland has done in that regard, in that transition?
I think there's so much more the city can do without a doubt. But Cleveland has a great framework. It has wonderful bones in terms of its ability to move beyond its current state. Everything from the arts, from University Circle, Case Western Reserve, but to the amazing neighborhoods and the unique history of Cleveland, to watch parts of the Huff area return, the history of Collinwood, East Cleveland, the rich history of the city is something to build on. And if you have leadership that knows the stories, knows the people, and recognizes that the lake that we sit on, we're not the mistake by the lake, we're the blessing next to this beautiful body of water.
Well, let's move to Chicago. You are engaged in all this incredible work you talked about in our 75th anniversary celebration, and this idea of green development and community empowerment. Tell us about the renovation, starting out with the church and then the library and the medical center and the housing as well.
Well, I came to Trinity United Church of Christ in 2006. The physical structure of the church was designed in the 80s, but it wasn't built until the 90s. Obviously, because of the design, they were not green savvy. And as many churches, you have a beautiful design, and then you have a committee that says, well, we can't afford this. We can't afford this. Let's go in this direction. And so when I arrived, we did an assessment of the building and realized that we really desperately needed a renovation. We used the Department of Energy's energy assessment, and the assessment goes from 0 to 100. 100, obviously, you are just a perfectly green building, I guess, net zero or something of that nature. And most buildings around our age would have fit between 40 and 60 range. 60 would have been excellent. 40 would have probably been more on the average older building needing some repair. We scored an 8. so it was obvious that we were losing so much energy, wasting so much money, that here you have people who are giving of their hard-earned dollars to support the ministry, and here we have a completely, utterly inefficient building that is wasting funding, that is wasting the tithes and offerings. And so that's when we went into the mode of doing the research of, hey, we're going to go green. And I was so excited about moving in this direction. My critical mistake was generational difference. I knew what green design was. I knew what eco development was. I was making an assumption that everybody did. And so when I gave the presentation, after we talked with the board and all of this, we were so excited, thought we were ready to go. Come to find out, thankfully, that as I was at a barber shop, my barber told me that there was a member of the church who was just mad as a hornet about what the new pastor was doing. And I said, please, tell me, but just don't mess up my line while you're doing it. He said, well, the person was in here and was saying that he's so mad that this new pastor wants to put a putting green on top of the church because this elder had never heard of green development. The only association with green he had was golf course. So he made the assumption that we were trying to put a putting green on top of the church. And so that was really a lesson in terms of communication and making sure that the population from a different generation is clear on the language. So we went back and redid everything. I had small group meetings with everyone who was 75 plus in their homes, not at the church. I went to their homes, we had dinner, and I explained everything. I said, what does green really mean? I said, green really means what your grandmother was. Your grandmother was green. She had a garden in the back. She didn't go to the grocery store all the time. She grew her own food. If you had cramps at a particular time of month, she would go and find certain herbs and make some tea, and you would drink that. She was green when she would take bits and pieces of cloth and make a quilt and wrap it around your body. That was all green. And all of a sudden, the elders are like, oh, absolutely. We're green. How are we going to do this? Said, we want to build a church. We want to renovate a church that we use the term creation care. That we're taking care of creation, taking care of the community, that this renovation would have a direct impact on the housing prices in our neighborhood since we were in a flood zone. And that since we were a larger landowner, we wanted the renovation to reduce flooding. So we made the design specifically to improve not only the sewer system, but in terms of how the water runoff would be from our building would collect the water to ensure that it would not affect houses on our block. And as a result, guess what? Housing prices went up as a result of our renovation because we wanted to be a good neighbor. And so green development for us is creation care. And then from there, we renovated a local library, the Carter G. Woodson Library, to ensure that it would use the pillars of our green design. Our green design uses several pillars. One, that it has to be creation care, green design. Two, community empowerment, that people from that neighborhood must do the work, must be the contractors. It must be people who are empowered, who live in that neighborhood. Otherwise, we have to throw out the project. The third piece was mass incarceration. Anyone who's returning from mass incarceration has to work on the project, be trained on that project, be paid on that project. Those three pillars were critical, and we used those three pillars for the renovation of the library. When we found out that the library down the street has the largest collection of African American literature in the Midwest. So the letters of W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells are kept at this library. The University of Chicago, Loyola University, University of Illinois utilizes this library for primary research. But because the original contractors did not do a proper job, the city, instead of renovating the library, decided to put a scaffolding around the library to make sure that bricks didn't fall on someone's head. And so the scaffolding was up for 20-odd years. It always looked like the library was under construction, but it wasn't. It was a stopgap because the city didn't want to spend the money. So our Community Development Corporation, called Andalea, did the research to find out how many libraries are being renovated in the city. How many regional libraries are there in Chicago? What regional libraries hold a treasure trove of archives such as the Carter G. Woodson Library? They got that research, went to the Library Commission. Library Commission then says, we don't have the money. I'm like, okay, great. When is your next meeting? And they said, it's Wednesday, 6:30. Oh, great. Thank you very much. And so on Sunday, I just tell the church, there's a Library Commission meeting on Wednesday. I'd like for you all to go. We shared the information about what we want to see. And I didn't show up. Specifically, I was not going to show up. But the Library Commission meeting was over at 7:59. I got a call at 8:01 saying that they wanted to meet immediately. Come to find out that several hundred people showed up to the Library Commission meeting. And nobody comes to a Library Commission meeting unless you're into the Dewey Decimal System or something of that nature. And they immediately wanted to meet with me and our team, and they came in with their briefcases and said, we found money for you. We found $10 million. It's like all of a sudden $10 million appears from the budget. And they thought that was it. And we said to them that the only way that this can move forward, it has to be green design. The community must be empowered in terms of the contractors, the workers. They have to benefit. You're not going to go and hire someone on the other side of town or outside of the city to do this work. This is community work. And then you're also going to hire men and women who are from the mass incarceration system. They said this has never been done. Then we shared with them what we did at our church. If a church that doesn't even have the fraction of the budget of the city can figure out how to frame empowerment through design, then why can't a city do it? Long story short, the city renovated the library. It is absolutely extraordinary. I encourage anyone who comes to Chicago to visit the Carter G. Woodson Library on the south side of Chicago, 95th and Halsted. It is amazing. It even has a studio for anyone who is doing podcasting. They want to produce their next radio or audio or a music project, 3D printers, you name it. It's amazing what they have done because of that partnership. We then also purchased 27 acres right down the street from the church. That was known as Amani Village is what we call it. And we partnered with the Advocate Healthcare. And on that 27 acres, we're creating a cradle-to-the-grave community. From the moment that someone is born to the moment that someone transitions, how do you design a community that allows people to flourish? From the design, creation care / green development, to the contractors, making sure that they come from that community, then also utilizing people from the mass incarceration system. Amani Village will be, when it's finished, close to a $125 million investment that has been sparked by a faith community. First phase was a medical center. not a clinic, a preventive care medical center, partnered with Advocate Healthcare, one of the largest healthcare providers in Illinois, run by 4 African-American women who are absolutely brilliant. And from there, we then moved to the housing. And we're now in the housing phase. From the housing phase, we'll go from housing, then also to a hotel. Reason of a hotel is we're right next to Chicago State. We are near 5 athletic facilities for young people, but none of those athletic facilities can have multi-day tournaments because there's no place for young people to stay. So we have these facilities, but everybody has to go to Indiana in order to actually have some type of athletic tournament. So we spend money in Indiana for our young people, but we have the facilities on the south side, but we don't have the place for them to stay because young people, if you have the 12 to 13, 14-year-olds, they have to stay a few miles from the athletic facility. Then we're planning what is known as a healing garden. We partnered with the Nature's Conservancy. They gave us an amazing grant to do the pre-planning. Advocate Healthcare, Nature Conservancy, looking at the idea of can you prescribe nature over medicine? So it's really a park. It's not a small garden. It's really a park with water features. It has a space for children to play. It walks through all of the different types of flowers and trees that are from the region in this park. Once you come to the end, there's a space for community music, gathering, yoga, whatever it may be. But the research that we did, we found out nature has a direct effect on the health of individuals. The sounds of children playing has a direct effect on someone's stress level. And then the sound of water. So we wanted to put that right there on the south side of Chicago, right next to Chicago State, right in the middle of the city, a place where people could literally decompress. The final phase of the project will be the largest urban farm in Chicago. It'll be roughly about 5 acres, where we'll grow the food. There'll be a food hub. There'll be a farmer's market, but there's a job training component. We want to create a system where someone coming from the mass incarceration system could be the truck driver or have his own company where he's delivering the food to local restaurants. This is the vision for Amani Village, and we think that that kind of vision could be laid out in any city across the country. Have a little faith and a little imagination, and something magnificent can be created in the process.
So interesting that the first reaction by the city on the library project was, we've never done this before. But you actually found that taking that template and those specifications, that it was something that local government could actually adopt and embrace. And it didn't matter that that wasn't the way that it was normally done. So was that a little bit inspiring?
It was very, very exciting. Most cities are bogged down with tradition. They're bogged down with red tape and bureaucracy. And that's what we were running into. Thankfully, we had some people who were in strategic places that were sharing with us that here's the frustration that they're having. Is you have company A that wants the project, but they've never done anything like this before. They do all the projects in the city, but they've never hired pretty much anybody from the neighborhood. They've never hired returning citizens. They struggle with that. There's an African-American firm that's smaller that can do the project, but they're not in the queue with the city. So we were getting the inside baseball of the way things work and why the same groups. In most cities, you maybe have 3 or 4 developers who primarily do all of the work, and it's through relationship. We were trying to break that so that new companies could come in who were deeply committed. They had an ethic around empowerment in terms of hiring and ensuring that people who normally would not have this opportunity would have the opportunity. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you get through that door, you're going to get other opportunities. The key is just allowing contractors, business leaders from the community who have a green creation care ethic, who are concerned about returning citizens. Once they get through the door, they're going to get hired again, and then the ball continues to roll from there. That's what we were trying to do. We were just really trying to start a really small revolution by busting up some bureaucracy.
You talk about organizations having a moral vision, a moral imagination, and I hoped you could reflect a little bit about how do you get to the moral in the area of green buildings and ultimately addressing the great crisis of our time, and that's climate change. How do you reach people at that level? and try to harness the power of that moral imagination?
We use the term creation care, that we are called to be stewards of creation as human beings. The challenge with green design is that people just see it as something that is aesthetic and solely for those who are privileged. But if we were to go across the world, pretty much everyone uses green design in any indigenous community, utilizing the materials that are right there in the community, in the neighborhood, in the village. 90 to 98% of the time, they are beneficial to the community. You can recycle those materials. They're not harmful to the environment. And then there's a story or a tradition in and around the use and building and implementation of those materials. And so bringing green design from looking through a catalog into responsibility, stewardship, and then taking just one step further from there, believing that green design is not only for the privileged, but is something that human beings have been using since human beings could figure out shelter. We were using wood and stone and mud, and, we were using things from the earth. So beginning there is how you begin to shape a moral imagination and then raise the question around what's going to be the benefit for not only the environment, but for humanity, which means that we have to juxtapose that in reference to revenue. It may not make the high level of revenue, but over time, it benefits society. And those are the questions. We can't let capital outstrip or outstretch our consciousness. So we have to think consciousness first and then shape the capital in order to benefit the community and allow us to be the appropriate stewards for our environment.
One of the other themes at the Lincoln Institute that we've done a lot of work on is this idea of land value capture. And this ties back to Henry George and a little bit back to Cleveland. And John C. Lincoln was really fascinated by the writings of Henry George. And it applies today in something like climate infrastructure. The ton of money that we're going to need to spend on resiliency measures, mitigation measures. It's going to cost a lot of money. And the idea is to have the private sector contribute much more, whereas in the past, they've kind of just walked away and they got a lot of stuff for free, essentially. So there's a moral dimension there. And I wondered if you have hope that that obligation will increasingly become more self-evident.
I think that there's a couple of key strategies. One is developers, most of them are just in it for the money. They're just looking at cost, benefit, rate of return analysis in the story. They're not necessarily concerned about saving the planet and empowering communities. If they add a sticker on that, then that's fine. So then that becomes the role of civic society, of politics, but specifically civic society. We have to create an ethic that says, what is it that we want as a community? I'm kind of a urban design nerd. I like architecture. I'm fascinated about how cities are designed and how we turned over design to developers who had no thought about how human beings function. So in the United States, everything is designed around a car, not for walking, not for biking. We don't have roads, we have stroads. They're not sure if they're highways or they're a road. And so we have to rethink design. And that's the civic responsibility, to say that this is how we're going to design things and this is why. It may not have the highest rate of return, but it has the highest rate of return in terms of human flourishing. That's what we have to do. When that happens, then your developers fall in line. Developers should not be telling us how to design. We should be sharing with them, this is the framework. People go to school for this. They study this in terms of how you can decrease stress and you can decrease acts of violence just by the design of a city. Let's use that. And it's cheaper on the front end than it is on the back end. So now we're looking at retrofitting things that we should have done 60, 70 years ago, and that we did start out doing. Every community had a small town square that you'd walk downtown and you got to know people. Well, guess what? When you get to know people, all of a sudden you decrease conflict between people. You put the church downtown which was interesting, not just because of worship, but all of the other activities that happen right there at the church, again, increases community. We obliterated that for strip malls. Strip malls are not designed to create community. They're designed for commerce, not consciousness. We've got to get back to the kind of design that allows people to flourish. There was a reason our ancestors used to design small villages the way that they did. They found that it created something known as community, which we are now struggling with. I use the example often talking about front porches. I mean, the beauty of the front porch, especially as it really developed out of, I believe it was Charleston, South Carolina, this design. My family's from the South. I consider myself a child of the South. The front porch is fascinating because, first of all, you sit on it and you get into everybody else's business. But you build community. So if something is going wrong in your community, you are then more likely to engage. But then you put a back porch, a private back porch, where you cut off the front because you want to be cut off from the community. Then all of a sudden we isolate ourselves. And then you have young people in a basement who are reading things, and all of a sudden they go out into a buffalo and they end up shooting someone. But if you have front porches, someone is raising the question, something's not right with John. Something's going on with Jimmy, because there at least is an elder's eye raising some questions.
Finally, I want to ask about the approach of an organization trying to make change. And that was, I believe you called it the jazz ethic. And indeed, you suggested that the Lincoln Institute had adopted a bit of a jazz ethic of policy. I am quite confident in saying that that is the first time that we've been described that way. Tell us about that jazz ensemble approach and how all the incredible work that you've done can remain dynamic and have an impact.
Well, jazz, I believe, is the best way to describe our aspirational democracy. The origins of jazz in New Orleans. You had free Haitians who had already defeated France in France's worst defeat in history because of Toussaint Louverture. Many of them come to New Orleans, and they are speaking about ideas of freedom with enslaved Africans and also with the indigenous population. Then you have the Spanish, German, Jewish, and also the French in that same space. And there's an area in New Orleans known as the Congo Square that, since it was primarily Catholic, you had people who were enslaved Africans that would have free space on Sunday. And in the Congo Square, the story, more as a griot story, is told that on those Sundays, the mingling of all of those sounds came together. And that's how jazz was born. And jazz is the unique American artistry that is birthed on this soil that tells us, teaches us what democracy is before America knew what democracy was all about. And so jazz demands instruments that are not supposed to play together, play together. The saxophone is from the marching band. It's not supposed to play with the piano, which is supposed to be European classical. And you have the trap drum set, but that trap drum set uses African polyrhythms. And you have a bass that's supposed to be played with a bow, but it's played with fingers. And each instrument is allowed to solo. In other words, come out of their own unique cultural narrative and share something to the entire production. And I believe that is what our democracy aspires to be able to create space where people from different backgrounds have the right to solo, but we are committing ourselves to the painting and development of a new composition, a yet-to-be composition in reference to this democratic experiment that we are a part of. And that's what jazz does. And what the Lincoln Institute is doing, it is also using the jazz ethic of policy. It is bringing together these elements that for others just looking, they don't seem to play together. And then creating policy that is centered on the development of the human being, that has a consciousness, that has a moral vision, a spirituality underneath. Whereas many other institutes can't play with a variety of indigenous and those who have been marginalized and those who are privileged, and then look at the idea of land and water as something that we are to be stewards of and not necessarily owners of. And that's the beauty of taking a jazz ethic. And then realizing that we've got to use improvisation, that what you did last week may not work this week, which means that you're going to have to change some chords in order for the song to be played for people to truly be able to hear and people to be able to flourish. And that's the jazz ethic that I believe that America must take hold of if America is to be an America.
Reverend Otis Moss III, thank you once again for being part of this conversation on Land Matters.
Thank you so much.
Well, we can't overstate our gratitude to Reverend Moss for addressing our group at Mountain Shadows as we gathered for a big final celebration of the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Lincoln Institute. We had mobile salons in a library with keepsakes and virtual reality tours of our work from Brazil to South Africa and beyond. To learn more, just go to our website, lincolninst.edu, and look for 75th anniversary. Also follow us on Twitter. The handle is @LandPolicy. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Please rate, review, subscribe, and recommend the show. And until next time, thanks for listening.